Mark 15. Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. Title for today, am I on?
I'll make you on.
Not. Make sure I'm pushing on at the, I'm on there. No, I'm on, I'm just not loud.
Make you louder.
Now I'm on. I was doing so good, y'all. My title for today is Jesus, the Sovereign Substitute. I came to talk about Jesus today. I hope you came to hear about Jesus. We talk about Jesus, who is the sovereign substitute. If you have paid any attention to the news this week, then you have heard something about the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Anybody heard a little bit about that this week? Yeah, some of us are like, okay, right? Well,
Not me.
maybe you're thinking to yourself, Kavanaugh, I didn't come to church to hear about that today. Well, I'm with you. But it is interesting to me that we have a at least similar situation in our text today. That's why I mentioned it, just because it would just be foolish to let such an event pass come into this text. Because if you're not on the polar opposite of the political spectrum, I'm not actually on the political spectrum, but so if you're somewhere off the spectrum with me, or you're somewhere towards the middle, and you're at least kind of honest with yourself, I hope we can agree that that whole situation, however you, or whoever you choose to believe, one thing we can be grateful for is there's something going on in our culture today that people can agree that somebody is right and somebody is wrong. The truth actually matters in this case. Now, the unfortunate thing is some people are very divided about the truth, and some people decided what they wanted to be true before any real investigating has been done. But what happened in the Kavanaugh and Ford hearings over the last couple of days has very much to do with our judicial system, but very little to do with seeking justice. It's a political situation that's playing out. There is a hearing that did not have anything to do with finding truth, but with people putting forward their political agenda and trying to get their way. So whatever your take on the particulars are, we have a contemporary example of a hearing in which the guilt of the accused is largely predetermined based on the desired outcome of the officials who are opposed to him. So we come to that today in our text. As Jesus stands before Pilate, or as I have heard multiple pastors argue, that it's actually Pilate who is before Jesus on this occasion. Mark chapter 15, verse 1. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them, and he answered them, saying, Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, Crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Father God, speak, for we are listening. And open our ears to hear wonderful things from your word. Do not leave us as we came in. In Christ we pray. Amen. Jesus is the sovereign substitute. We will see two simple things today. We will see that Jesus has amazing sovereignty, and we will see that Jesus is an amazing substitute. We look first at the amazing sovereignty of Jesus. As you look at this story, and I couldn't help but ask myself, I think you should ask yourself, who has the power? Who's in authority? Who's in control of this situation? Because it might seem that the chief priests get their way, and it might seem that Pilate is the one with the authority to rule this situation, and it might seem that the crowd is getting their way by mob rule, but I want to suggest to you that it is in fact Jesus who's in control. The first thing we see here is verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. That's to say, all the collected religious leaders got together and they consulted. Now, they had figured out through the night what they were going to do, but to have any sort of semblance of legality, a Jewish trial had to occur during daylight. And so, having already bound him, judged him for blasphemy up in chapter 14, and begun beating him themselves, humiliating him through the night, they again, and passing him back and forth, and we're not going to get into all that because Mark doesn't. But here they gather in the morning again to declare their purpose, and they bind Jesus. They bound Jesus. The chain breaker was bound. Y'all think he had to stay bound? The one who spoke the world into existence, the one who could call people from life or from death to life, the one who could set people free from the demons that bound them. Whether they were ropes or chains, I don't know, but they bound Jesus, but Jesus was not bound. They led Jesus, it says. They led him away. They led him away, but it had been Jesus' stated intention since the middle of this book, since the middle of the book or the gospel account of Mark, but even from the foundation of the world, it had been his intention to go to the cross. that he might come forth from the tomb. They're leading Jesus, but he's walking right where he wants to go. They delivered Jesus. They delivered him over to Pilate. They delivered Jesus over to Pilate because the Jewish religious leaders did not have the authority to execute him themselves. They didn't have the power of the sword. They didn't have the power to administer death. Now, if you know your Bible, maybe you've never thought about it. I had never thought about it until I was coming through this a little bit ago, and it occurred to me, they get over this really fast. Because you get after the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, the 40 days, then you get the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, and there's a little bit of time, and then very soon, the Jewish religious leaders start killing Christians right and left. And the Romans don't do anything to stop them. At least not much. And it's interesting that at this point, they're really concerned about the execution of Jesus not being on them, it being on the Romans. They get over that once Jesus is raised from the dead and his people start going around and talking about it. In verse 2, Pilate questions Jesus, and Jesus answers Pilate, sort of. Are you the king of the Jews? That's the accusation that matters to Pilate. The blasphemy, the things dealing with the temple, none of that is Pilate's concern. He does not care. But this accusation that someone has stepped forward and put themselves out there as a king, that matters to Pilate because he's the Roman governor. He is under the authority of Caesar. Caesar is the emperor. And when kings rise to power in your empire, that can be tricky. That's why Herod had tried to have the king of the Jews that was born back when Jesus was born, killed back when Jesus was a child. That's coming up at Christmas time. But Pilate asks this question, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says, you say. This is a two-word response. You say. Now it's translated here as you have said so, right? Or it could be just simply, you said it. There's no real indication as to whether or not he's trying to be non-committal or he's trying to affirm this statement, and I think that's intentional. I think Pilate was supposed to be able to hear it however he wanted to hear it. Jesus sort of affirms it. Now, he clearly affirmed himself as the Son of God who is going to come and rule and reign in authority and power, and that's up in chapter 14, verses 60 and 62. When he's before the religious leaders, they ask him, the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? He doesn't answer those accusations. He remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? That is to say, the Son of God. And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. That's not ambiguous. That's clear. That is a straightforward statement of Jesus and his deity and his intention to rule and reign as king. Here before Pilate, he's a little bit more vague. And then the religious leaders, they accuse him further in verse 3, and Pilate questions him further along these same lines that they accused him before, I'm sure. Jesus does not answer further, though. In keeping with what is prophesied about him in Isaiah 53:7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter is silent, or like a sheep before its shearers is silent. He opened not his mouth. That's what Jesus is doing there. Man, that's a baller move. Like back to this Kavanaugh thing, if he had walked in and said, after the accusations have been made, you've made accusations. And he said no further word. What? That would have been crazy. People would have lost their minds. Be like, accusations have been made, so what? Drop the mic, walk out. Just dare them to actually investigate without actually stating anything further. He didn't do that, if you know what happened, and I don't really think that would have been the right move for him, but it would have been an interesting move. And Jesus does this here, and Pilate is amazed. Jesus is not groveling. Jesus is not pleading for his life. He's not even pleading his case. He's just ignoring the accusations because, well, on their face they are ridiculous. But Jesus makes no further response. Pilate was amazed. Pilate was amazed. Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus. He wanted to be like Jesus. That word amazed carries with it some of the idea of being impressed, of admiring the one who he's amazed at. Jesus, in Pilate's eyes, seems to have a power and authority and a way about him that says that he's in complete control in spite of the fact that he's on trial and about to be executed. The other Gospels deal with that in their own way, and Pilate says some interesting things, but we're going to stick to Mark this morning. Down in verse 10, it says that Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. Envy. My sister's old Webster's dictionary says that envy is the discontented desire for someone else's possessions or advantages. Pilate didn't want to kill Jesus. He was amazed by Jesus. The religious leaders, they did want to kill Jesus because they weren't like Jesus and they couldn't be like Jesus. They weren't amazed, they were envious. It is an amazing sovereignty that Jesus has here. So some things can be impressive without being powerful. I don't know if y'all know this. Chrome does not make your car go faster. Neither does a slick paint job or stickers. Right? And oddly enough, that motor, or that muffler that makes some cars so loud can steal your horsepower. You can be sitting at a stoplight with one in front of you that's driving a 4-cylinder import with a fat muffler and a bunch of stickers, and they can sound like a monster. You can sit there with a Lamborghini or a Porsche, and it's not making a sound at all. But if they want to, when that light turns green, that Porsche is going to fly. That little four-banger isn't going to go anywhere nearly as fast as that Porsche or that Lamborghini or that guy. I had a friend in college. I cannot verify this story, but he said that one time he was going to change out a motor in an old Chevy truck. And so he sent for the big motor that would go in this big Chevy truck. He wanted to be able to go off-road and pull things and stuff like that, right? And what they sent him was a Camaro engine, which was actually bigger than the engine he had intended to get for this truck, and more expensive, but apparently the shipping costs and the trouble at the distributor or factory or whatever, that was going to cost them more for them to switch the engines back out. So they were like, hey, if you're okay with this, you just keep that engine. because Camaro is a Chevy product. It would fit in the truck, and so he put it in there. This engine was so powerful that the dude had to put steel plates down in the back of his bed so that the rear tires would maintain traction. He said he got pulled over one day by a cop, and because he was going so fast on these backcountry roads, he had gone past the speedometer, and he got pulled over because they were just trying to see how fast he could go. And when he showed the officer the engine, the officer just said, "You know what? Slow down." And he walked away from the situation because he was just so amazed at the power of this truck that on the outside didn't seem all that impressive, but had all this crazy power under the hood. Pilate was amazed because the sovereignty of Jesus that's on display here is amazing. Because Jesus is right where he wants to be. Jesus is the king. He is the king. So he doesn't have anything to prove either to Pilate or to the chief priests and the scribes and the Sanhedrin council. He doesn't have anything to prove. He does have work to do. Because he's got work to do, he does his work. And he stays silent, fulfilling the scriptures, so that he can go to the cross, fulfilling the scriptures, so that he can rise from the dead, fulfilling the scriptures, and setting us free. Which is what brings us to the next thing, is the amazing substitution of Jesus. Down from 6 to 15 is where we see this kind of played out in a picture that gets us somewhere. Verses 12 through 14, you have Pilate, I'm jumping ahead of myself. In verse 6, we get this info, this background detail about this custom that they have of releasing a prisoner, which is the kind of thing that the Roman governors could do at special celebrations. They got the option to kind of help the people celebrate by setting a prisoner free every now and then if they wanted to. If that helped them maintain control, then they could do that sort of thing. And so there was this custom, and there was a guilty man. There were actually multiple guilty men. At least 2 of them went to the cross alongside Jesus. I think Barabbas was probably supposed to be on that 3rd cross that day, but there was this custom of releasing a prisoner, and there were guilty men in prison. One of them was called Barabbas. Barabbas is an interesting name. It means Bar, that is son of, Abbas, the father. Which is kind of a weird name, right? I'm just going to call my son the son of a father. Well, that's better than the son of a lot of things you could be called, but Barabbas is a son of a father. He's in prison because he's a murderer and an insurrectionist and a rebel against the Roman rule. That is not the guy that a Roman governor wants to let go. Pilate, however, doesn't only have guilty men in prison, he has an innocent man in prison. But back in verse 8, the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. This was a crowd with a purpose. Now, the consultation happens just after daybreak. They're bringing Jesus. Jerusalem's not that big. It doesn't take them that long to get from where they were to where they are. And there's already this crowd there. I wonder how this crowd got together so early in the morning with the sole purpose of seeing Jesus crucified. I wonder if maybe the chief priests and the religious leaders and the whole council, at least the whole council that got up early that morning, because we know Joseph of Arimathea, he was part of the Sanhedrin, he was part of the council, but he didn't get up because he wasn't there to cry for Jesus to be crucified, because he is the one who takes him off the cross. Same with Nicodemus. But there were enough people gathered that morning with this purpose. funny how that is. They came out of the woodwork to do the things that they thought was right. Now, it's usual that you would have people asking for Pilate to release a prisoner. It is unusual, perhaps very unusual, that they would gather so early and demand so specifically to have this particular one. See, Pilate, verse 9 and 10, Pilate has an innocent man in prison, one they called the King of the Jews. So you got one called Barabbas, son of a father. You've got one called the King of the Jews, who claims himself to be the son of the Father. And they, the religious leaders, the chief priests and their folks, they incite the crowd to demand Barabbas' release and Jesus' death. And this relates very closely to what you see over in Leviticus 16, and the idea on the Day of the Atonement. You'd have one animal that would have placed on it the sins of the nation, and be, as a sacrifice, one that would have placed on it the sins of the nation and would be sent off into the wilderness. One animal would go to die, one would go free to live. Now, they messed that picture up by, eventually, the custom was that you chase the goat out into the wilderness and off a cliff, or you killed it or whatever. But the imagery stands that Barabbas, who just as easily, and perhaps more so, deserved to be on that cross, definitely more so, deserved to be on that cross, he is chosen to go free, while Jesus is chosen to hang on the cross. They incite the crowd to demand Barabbas' release and Jesus' death. And there's a side note, kind of warning there, that we need to be careful not to become part of the crowd. That when people in political situations, with opinions, or concerned about social issues of our day, or concerned about things going on in our families, or concerned about things going on in our church, or things going on across town, we don't need to just be part of the crowd. Not waiting for processes to work themselves out, not waiting for justice to be done, not waiting for truth to be made clear, but just picking our side and crying for somebody's death. That's not who we need to be. Be careful not to become part of the crowd. And Pilate did here, jumping down to verse 15, Pilate does what Jesus wanted. Verse 15, so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pilate does it wishing to satisfy the crowd, but it is in fact the satisfaction of Jesus. It is the satisfaction of the Father. It is the satisfaction of the Scriptures. It is the satisfaction of the Holy Spirit who inspired the Scriptures. It is to the satisfaction of us even, though we didn't know it at the time. Pilate wishes to satisfy the crowd. But see, what happens here is to bring satisfaction, the guilty one is made free and the innocent one is made to die, which was the plan. It's always been the plan. It's been the plan from back at the beginning. It's the plan that Jesus has been talking about to his disciples. He repeats it repeatedly in Mark, and it's that he, for this purpose, came to be delivered over, to suffer, and to die, so that he might rise as king. Sometimes you lose to win at a game that the people you're playing against didn't know you were. Sometimes you win to lose. Every parent knows this. Sometimes you don't really care that your kid is not really understanding the strategy of the game you're playing, and so you play poorly so they can win. Now, whether that's checkers or chess, or whether that's ball in the yard, You may stumble so that your kid can run and get the touchdown. You may miss the ball so that he can round the bases. You may be playing a game with a longer view than winning whatever the competition is right then. Husbands know this. Wives, you know this. But sometimes you'll wives don't let their husbands win in anything. Husbands, you know this, and wives will tip you off to something. That sometimes your husband will let you win at whatever the issue is at hand, so that he wins in the end. So I had a guy at church I used to be at who would say, you can be, in your marriage, you can be right, or you can be happy. Now, I take a little bit of issue with Stan. Some things are worth being right on, but I know what he's trying to say there. You probably do too. Sometimes you lose in order to win a different game. Jesus, he's going for the eternal win. He's going for the thing that gets for him an eternal weight of glory that is a benefit to him and to those who will be his people. Pilate did what Jesus wanted. 1 Peter 3:18 tells us that Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. That's what he's going for. Isaiah 53 again, that chapter, which is all about the suffering servant who is Jesus, says that out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. Jesus is the one who is satisfied here. Not the crowd, not Pilate, not the religious leaders. It's Jesus who gets what he wants. And it's an amazing substitution that occurs here. Pilate, in the process of this substitution occurring, asks two incredibly important questions. He asks, what shall I do with the King of the Jews? It's a good question for all of us. What are you going to do with the King of the Jews? What will you do with Jesus? You can accept him as the sovereign who has stood in your place for your sin. And you can follow or you can reject him. None of this matters. It doesn't really affect my daily life. It didn't really happen. And even if it did happen, I don't much care. You got to do something with Jesus. What are you going to do with the King of the Jews? That's a good question. He also asks, what evil has he done? What evil has he made? What unclean thing has he brought about? What worthless thing has this man, who they desperately want to kill, what reason has he given them? What evil has he done? What wrong has God done to you? What is your excuse for not submitting to this good king? You better have a good reason to reject the one who would go and stand in your place and die for your sin. Jesus has worked in your salvation. He's worked for your salvation in ways that you can't understand. He's worked for your good in ways that you cannot understand. Do you know that God, in his wisdom, knows more than you? And so that if you don't understand what's going on, it could be that God knows more than you. We talked a little bit about this in Sunday school. Michelle asked, how do I rejoice when I'm drowning? Sometimes you just hold on while you're drowning, waiting for the fish to swallow you. Sometimes you cry out to Jesus and he takes you by the hand and he pulls you on top of the waves. That doesn't mean that at some point you won't be drowning. It just means that there's more to come. There's more story left to be played out. How has Jesus failed you? Because what I see is I see Jesus on the cross, dying for my sins and rising from the dead and offering me life eternal. And so it doesn't matter what it looks like from my perspective, I can trust He knows best. And even if I can't see how it's good, I can trust that He is good. Because it may be that some of the struggles and pain and suffering, and I know we got some struggles and pain and suffering in this room. It might be that the things that you can't conceive how that was good are the very things that set you on a path to find and trust in Christ Himself. It might be that the terriblest things in your life pointed you to Jesus in ways that had they not happened, you never would have walked. Pilate asked these two important questions. We should ask these two important questions. What are you going to do with Jesus? And what's your excuse? Because from the perspective of eternity, He's been at work to save you from before the beginning. Jesus has worked for your salvation in ways you cannot understand. Again, 1 Peter 3, out of the midst of it, Peter says, "For it is better to suffer for doing good." Speaking of us, in light of who Jesus is and what He did, we ought to live out the truth that it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. If we're going to be suffering, then we ought to suffer in line with God's plan. Romans 8:26. Well, I was going to read 26 through 30, but I'll just keep it at 28. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Oh, and ultimately you get to the end of that in verse 29. To be conformed into the image of His Son. So, footsteps of Jesus. We will follow the steps of Jesus wherever they go. You know, the steps of Jesus took Him into bondage, to be delivered over, to be falsely accused, to be flogged, to be crucified. But resurrection is coming. That doesn't mean we don't have to go through the crucifixion. Jesus is amazingly sovereign. Jesus has achieved an amazing substitution. Jesus is the sovereign substitute. Will we follow Him? Will we trust Him? Because He was accused, you will be accused, have been accused, but you can be acquitted. Because He was judged as guilty, if you'll confess that you are guilty, then you can be declared innocent. Because He suffered as unrighteous, then you, if He'll have it His way, you can be rewarded as righteous. Isn't this grace so amazing? Pilate, who delivered Jesus over to be crucified, was amazed by Him. Shouldn't we, whom He was crucified to deliver, shouldn't we be amazed by Him? Shouldn't we gather to be amazed by Him? Shouldn't we come together week by week and just be amazed by Him and let that change us? Shouldn't we talk about Him through our daily lives, through our week, and just one to another be amazed by Him? Shouldn't we scatter and leave this place and go out and talk with other people about how amazing He is? Shouldn't we trust in His amazing kingly work, even if we don't understand it, even if we can't quite see it? Shouldn't we trust His kingly rule over us in all circumstances? Shouldn't we live differently since He has given His life for ours? Since He has taken our death and offers us His life? I, for one, still stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. And I wonder how He could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. But oh, how marvelous. Oh, how wonderful. That's what my song shall ever be. And so I thank you. Thank you for coming and spending this time just being amazed by Jesus today. Let's do that again next week. Let's find time throughout this week to be amazed at Jesus. Amen. Let's pray. Father God in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for your word, and I pray